'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. When the phone rang with a clatter, a thud on the roof, the smell of smoke, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter, when what to my wondering eyes should appear, to see my house was on fire. Yeah, I know, the last part didn't rhyme very well. I'm no poet, but I tried. This Christmas mystery takes us to Fayetteville, West Virginia in the United States, and we are going to be talking about a tragedy that struck the Sodder family on Christmas Eve 1945. As with most families, Christmas was a festive occasion for the Sodder family who lived just outside of Fayetteville, North Carolina. However, what transpired this Christmas Eve would turn from the magic of Christmas to the nightmare before Christmas. According to all accounts, the Sodder family was a big, happy Italian family living the American dream. George Sodder, the father, was born Giorgio Sudo in Tula, Sardinia, Italy in 1895. At the tender age of 13, he immigrated to the United States in 1908. He arrived in the States with his older brother, who decided to go back home to Italy as soon as they had cleared customs at Ellis Island. George, though, he stayed in the United States for the rest of his life, and for whatever reason, he never did talk about why he had actually left Italy. One day, George walked into a local store called the Music Box and met the owner's daughter, Jenny Cipriani, who had come over from Italy when she was just 3. Eventually, the couple married, and together they had 10 children. Their family home was a 2-story timber frame house located just outside Fayetteville, which, by the way, had a large population of Italian immigrants. The couple's first child was born in 1923, and their last child was born in 1943. The family was prospering as George had a successful business. He had started his own trucking company, hauling dirt to construction sites and then coal that was mined in the area. The family was described as, quote, one of the most respected middle-class families around. Yet, despite this, George had strong opinions, and he was not afraid to express those opinions. In particular, he was opposed to the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, and this had led to some heated arguments with other members of the immigrant community. Moreover, not everybody liked George because of his outspoken views on Mussolini, and many people described the family as strange. By Christmas Eve of 1945, Mussolini had been overthrown and executed. Nevertheless, the Italian community of Fayetteville held strong opinions about him and their homeland. Now, as I mentioned, Christmas Eve was a special occasion in the Sodder household. The family celebrated the holiday together, even though the second oldest child, Joseph, was away at war. The youngest Sodder girls were very excited. The girls had some new toys that their big sister Marion had surprised them with from her job at a dime store in Fayetteville. Martha, 12, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, were so excited that they asked their mother if they could stay up late past their regular bedtime. Jenny told them that they could stay up a little bit later as long as the 2 oldest boys, who were still awake, 14-year-old Maurice and his 9-year-old brother Louis, remembered to put the cows in and feed the chickens before going to bed themselves. George and the 2 oldest boys, John, who was 23, and George Jr., who was 16, had spent the day working and were already asleep. After reminding the children of those remaining chores, Jenny took Sylvia, who was 2, upstairs with her, and they went to bed together around 10 p.m. Jenny awoke to the phone ringing at 12:30 a.m. She ran downstairs to answer it. A woman she didn't recognize asked for someone Jenny didn't know. Jenny heard laughter and glasses clinking in the background. She told the caller that she had the wrong number and recalled later that the woman had a weird laugh. After getting off the phone, Jenny went back upstairs to bed, but on her way back upstairs, she noticed that the lights were still on and the curtains were not drawn downstairs. 2 things the children normally did when they stayed up later than their parents. She noticed that Marion had fallen asleep on the living room couch, and she assumed the other children had gone up to their bedrooms in the attic. So she closed the curtains, turned out the lights, and went back to bed. She was again awoken by a loud bang and a rolling noise as an object hit the roof at 1 a.m. Hearing nothing else, she went back to sleep. She awoke again a half an hour later, smelling smoke. She got up to investigate and found that George's office, including the telephone line and fuse box, was on fire. She woke George up and he hollered upstairs to wake up his older sons. John, in turn, tried to wake the younger children who were up in the attic, but the stairs were already ablaze. George and Jenny, with 4 of their children, Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr., escaped the house. Reportedly, the boys had barely escaped their upstairs bedrooms and their hair was even singed. All hands were frantically yelling to the children in the attic, but they got no response, and since the stairs were already on fire, they couldn't reach them to save them. They soon realized that their phone wasn't working either, so Marion went to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. A driver on a nearby road had also seen the flames and called the fire department from a nearby tavern. Both calls to the fire department were actually unsuccessful. You see, making calls back in that day was a lot more complicated. You had to reach an operator who then connected your call. It's unclear, but either the neighbor or the passing motorist was eventually successful in reaching the fire department from another phone in the center of town. Meanwhile, back at the house, George, frantic with fear, climbed the wall barefoot and broke open an attic window, cutting his arm pretty badly in the process. But he couldn't see anything through the smoke and fire, which by this point had entirely swept through the downstairs rooms. Why didn't he just use a ladder, you might wonder? Well, his ladder, which was always propped up against the house, wasn't there and could not be found anywhere nearby. George hoped to douse the fire with water from a water barrel, but it was frozen solid. Frustrated and running out of time, George knew the remaining 5 kids were probably cowering in fear in the 2 upstairs bedrooms separated by the staircase that was ablaze. He tried to pull both of the trucks he used for his business up to the house and climb up to the attic window, but neither of the trucks would start despite having worked perfectly that previous day. George and Jenny, with their children Marion 17, Sylvia 2, John 23, and George Jr., who was 16, had no choice but to watch the house burn and collapse in front of their eyes over the next 45 minutes. They assumed the other 5 children had perished in the fire. Lost in the fire were Maurice, 14, Martha Lee, 12, Louis, 10, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 6. Back in those days, the fire department didn't even have a siren. Instead, when a call came in, an operator had to contact a firefighter, who then, in turn, contacted another firefighter, and so on until all the firefighters were contacted. Due to the fact that it was Christmas Eve and that there was already a shortage of manpower because of the war, and the fact that the fire chief, F.J. Morris, was not able to drive the fire truck. Yep, he couldn't drive the fire truck, and he had to wait until someone who knew how to drive that truck arrived. Help did not arrive at the Sodder household until 8 a.m. Christmas morning, even though the fire department was only 2.5 miles away, or about 4 kilometers for us Canadians, which is only about a 4 or 5 minute drive. And by this time, all that was left of the Sodder house was a smoldering pile of ash that had collapsed into the basement. The firefighters, one of whom was Jenny's brother, could do little but look through the ashes that were left in the basement. George and Jenny were too grief-stricken to attend the funeral on January 2nd, 1946, although their surviving children did. George and Jenny never did rebuild their house. Instead, they created a memorial garden for the lost children. And this is when the story turns from a Christmas tragedy into a Christmas mystery. So in his first police interview after the fire, John claimed that he went up to the attic to wake his siblings, but he later changed his story to say he only called up there and did not see them. By 10 a.m., after only 2 hours of searching, mind you, Chief Morris told the Sodders that they had not found any bones, as might have been expected if the other children had been in the house as it burned. In another account, they did find a few bone fragments and internal organs, but chose not to inform the family. I'm going to go with the first statement that they did not find any bones or remains, because this is a mystery that persists to today. I'm not sure which account is correct, but it is safe to say that the search of the remains of the house was cursory at best, according to modern standards. And it is probably safe to say that one would expect to find more than just a few bone fragments and internal organs from 5 people who had burned, especially for a fire that reportedly had only burned for 45 minutes. Though I have seen other reports that suggested that the fire did smolder all night. But now anyone who is into true crime probably knows how hard it is to burn a body and leave no evidence. I've heard of stories where bodies have burned for days and evidence still exists. That being said, it was 1945, technology was hardly advanced, and the search did only last for 2 measly hours. And I think that is where the mystery started. I'm pretty sure if a proper search would have been conducted and remains recovered, at least something, there would be no mystery. But there wasn't, so here we are, talking about this story still in 2024. Anyway, Chief Morris nonetheless believed the 5 unaccounted for children had perished in the fire, suggesting that it was hot enough to burn their bodies completely. I think we know by now that that's probably not true, but they wouldn't have known that probably in 1945. So Chief Morris instructed George to leave the site undisturbed so that the State Fire Marshal's office could conduct a more thorough investigation. But, oh my god, after just 4 days, George and Jenny couldn't bear the sight anymore, which I totally understand, so George bulldozed 5 feet of dirt over the site with the intention of turning it into a memorial garden for the lost children. I know in his grief he was doing what he thought was right, but he ruined the scene and pretty much literally buried any evidence, which is terrible because maybe if that second, more thorough investigation would have taken place, we may not have a mystery on our hands today. I don't know. Anyway, the local coroner conducted an inquest which concluded that the fire was an accident caused by faulty wiring, and a death certificate was issued for the 5 children on December 30th, 1945. It wouldn't take long before George and Jenny started to believe somehow, someway, their 5 unaccounted for children were in fact not deceased, but missing. And to this day, the bodies of the 5 children have never been found, and the Sodders believed for the rest of their lives that the 5 missing children had actually survived. Several unusual circumstances led the Sodders to believe this. In the early days following the fire, the local newspaper contradicted itself, stating that all the bodies had been found, but then later in the same story, reporting that only part of one body had been recovered. Despite the fire department's finding that the fire was electrical in origin, George didn't agree, noting that the house was recently rewired and had been inspected and passed. Not only that, but George and Jenny wondered why, if the fire had been caused by an electrical problem, why had the family's Christmas lights remained on throughout the fire's early stages, when the power should have gone out. George and Jenny suspected arson for the cause of the fire. Then they found the ladder that had been missing from the side of the house on the night of the fire at the bottom of an embankment 75 feet away. Weird. It was a telephone repairman who informed the Sodders that the house's phone line had not been burned through in the fire as they initially believed, but had been cut by someone who had climbed up 14 feet up the pole and reached out 2 feet away from the pole in order to do so. Now that was suspicious. And during the fire, a man was seen by neighbors stealing a block and tackle from the property. He was identified and arrested, and despite admitting the theft and claiming that he was the one who cut the phone line, thinking that it was a power line, he denied having anything to do with the fire. However, no record identifying this suspect exists that I could find, and why he would have wanted to cut any utility lines to the Sodder house while stealing the block and tackle has never been explained, to my knowledge. So that's definitely strange and suspicious. The Sodders' truck's failure to start was also considered. George believed that they had been tampered with, perhaps by the same person who had stolen the block and tackle and cut the phone line, but one of his sons-in-law had reportedly said that he had come to believe that George and his sons may have flooded the engines in their rush to start the trucks, but we will never know. The wrong number phone call to the Sodder house earlier that night may have also been connected to the fire and the children's disappearance, George and Jenny believed. But the woman who had placed the call was identified and claimed that the phone call had indeed been a mistake on her part. Now, oddly, just 2 months before the fire in October of 1945, a life insurance salesman had visited George. George did not buy insurance, and as a result of this refusal, the visiting salesman warned George that his house would, quote, go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed due to George's, quote, dirty remarks about Mussolini. A second visitor, supposedly looking for work, warned George that a pair of fuse boxes would, quote, cause a fire someday. And this puzzled George because, like I said, he had just finished rewiring the house for an electrical stove that he had installed, and the local electrical company had said that it was safe. So those were 2 strange remarks indeed. George's older sons also had noticed a mysterious car parked along the main road through the town when the younger Sodder children returned from school in the weeks leading up to Christmas that year. Jenny also had a hard time accepting the fire chief's belief that the fire had completely destroyed the bodies of the children because some of the household appliances were still recognizable, and they were found in the ash, as were pieces of the tin roof. Jenny compared results of the fire with a newspaper account of a similar house fire that she had read about that happened around the same time that killed a family of 7, and the skeletal remains of all the victims were reported to have been found in that case, which I would say that would be what one would expect. So to test her theory that bones could not be completely burnt in a fire like the one that they had had, Jenny burned small piles of animal bones to see if they would be completely consumed. None ever were. And an employee of a local crematorium that she had contacted told her that human bones remain intact even after bodies are burnt at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours, which is far longer and far hotter than the house fire could have ever been. So why indeed were there no remains? Was it because of a shitty investigation, or was it because that they actually were not there? As more developments occurred in 1946, the family became increasingly convinced that the children were in fact still alive. Several pieces of evidence emerged that supported their belief that the fire had not been caused by the electrical fault and was intentionally started. For instance, a bus driver who passed through Fayetteville late Christmas Eve reported seeing some people throwing fireballs at a house. And some months after the fire, when the snow had melted, Sylvia, their 2-year-old, had found a small, hard, dark green, rubbery ball-like object in the brush nearby. George, recalling his wife's account of a loud thump on the roof before the fire, said it looked like a pineapple bomb, a hand grenade, or some other explosive device used in combat. The family later claimed that, contrary to the fire marshal's conclusion, the fire had started on the roof, although by then there was actually no way to prove that. Stranger again, witnesses started coming forward claiming to have seen the children themselves. While the house was burning that Christmas Eve, a woman came forward and reported that she had seen some of the children peering out of a passing car. At a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, a woman came forward and said that she had served the children breakfast the next morning, Christmas morning, pointing out a car with Florida license plates parked in the rest stop's parking lot. So the Sodders hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley from the nearby town of Galley Bridge to look into the case. So Tinsley learned that the insurance salesman who had threatened George with fire over his anti-Mussolini sentiments had actually been on the coroner's jury that ruled that the fire was an accident. He also learned that despite telling the Sodders that no remains were found in the ashes, Fire Chief Morris had actually found a heart, which he packed into a metal box and secretly buried. Apparently, Chief Morris had confessed this to a local minister who confirmed it to George. So George and Tinsley went to Morris and confronted him with the news. Long story short, the metal box was dug up and a local funeral director examined what was found inside the box and concluded that it actually was a fresh beef liver that had never been exposed to fire. Rumor spread that Morris had later admitted that the box with the liver did not actually come from the fire. Supposedly, or allegedly, he placed it there in hopes that the Sodders would find it and be satisfied that the missing children had indeed died in the fire. I must say, that is very weird. Now, George did not wait for reports of sightings. He sometimes made them for himself. After seeing a picture of a girl in a magazine of young ballet dancers in New York City who looked like one of his missing daughters, Betty, George drove all the way to the girls' school where his repeated demands to see the girl himself were refused. George also tried to interest the FBI in investigating what he considered a kidnapping, but Director J. Edgar Hoover personally responded to George's letters saying, quote, "Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this Bureau. If the local authorities requested the Bureau's assistance, they would of course direct agents to assist, but in the end, the Fayetteville Police and the fire departments declined to do so." In August of 1949, George was able to persuade Oscar Hunter, who was a Washington, D.C. pathologist, to supervise a new search through the dirt at the house site. After a very long, thorough search, artifacts including a dictionary that had belonged to the children and some coins were found. Several small bone fragments were unearthed and were determined to have been human vertebrae. The bone fragments were sent then to Marshall T. Newman, a specialist at the Smithsonian Institution. The bones were confirmed to be lumbar vertebrae, all from the same person. The age of the person the vertebrae belonged to was determined to be 16 or 17, with the top limit of this age to be about 22, meaning that it was not likely that these bones were from any of the 5 missing children, since the oldest, Maurice, had been 14 at the time of the fire. Although it was also noted in the report that the vertebrae of a boy his age sometimes could be advanced enough to appear to be at the lower end of the range that they gave of 16 to 17. But the report also noted that the bones did not show any signs of exposure to flame, and it was further stated that it was very strange that those were the only bones found, since a wood fire of such short duration should have left full skeletons of all of the children behind. In the end, the report concluded that the vertebrae had instead most likely come from the dirt that George had bulldozed over the site. And to that end, Tinsley supposedly confirmed that the bone fragments had come from a cemetery in nearby Mount Hope, but could not explain why they had been taken from there or how they came to be at the fire site. This investigation and its findings did attract national attention, but at the end of the day, the governor and the state police superintendent told the Sodders the case was hopeless and closed it at the state level. With the end of official efforts to resolve the case, the Sodders did not give up hope, though. They had flyers printed up with pictures of the children offering a $5,000 reward, which would soon be doubled, for information that would have settled the case for even one of the children. In 1952, George and Jenny put up a billboard at the site of the house and another along U.S. Route 60 near Ansted with the same information. This billboard would actually become a landmark for nearly 4 decades for traffic going through Fayetteville on U.S. Route 19, or today State Route 16. The billboard remained up until 1989, shortly after Jenny Sodder's death. On the billboard are Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. Under each picture is their names and ages and speculation about what happened to them. The billboard read, quote, "On Christmas Eve 1945, our home was set afire and 5 of our children, ages 5 through 14, kidnapped. The officials claimed defective wiring, although lights were still burning after the fire started. The official report stated that the children died in the fire. However, no bones were found in the residue, and there was no smell of burning flesh during or after the fire. What was the motive of the law officers involved? What did they have to gain by making us suffer all these years of injustice? Why did they lie and force us to accept those lies?" Picture number 6, received in 1967. Louis, one and the same, now in another state. The family's efforts soon brought another reported sighting of the children after the fire. A woman who ran a Charleston hotel claimed to have seen the children approximately a week after the fire. She claimed that the children had come in around midnight with 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to be Italian. When she attempted to speak with the children, quote, "One of the men looked at me in a hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to me." She recalled that they left the hotel the next morning. Investigators today, though, do not, however, consider her story credible, as she had only first seen the picture of the children 2 years after the fire, and it would have been another 5 years before she actually came forward with her information. George continued to follow up leads in person. Like I mentioned before, he traveled to areas from where tips came in. A woman from St. Louis, Missouri, claimed that Martha was being held in a convent there. A bar patron in Texas claimed to have overheard 2 people making incriminating statements about a fire that happened on Christmas Eve in West Virginia some years before. None of these tips proved to be significant. When George heard later that a relative of Jenny's in Florida had children that looked similar to his, the relative had to actually prove that the children were his own before George was satisfied. In 1967, George went to the Houston area to investigate another tip. A woman there had written to the family saying that Louis had revealed his true identity to her one night after having too much to drink. She believed that he and Maurice were both living in Texas somewhere. So George and his son-in-law, Grover Paxton, traveled to Texas. Although they were unable to speak with the woman, police were able to help them find the 2 men that she had indicated. But the men denied being the missing boys. Paxton would later say that doubts about that denial lingered in George's mind for the rest of his life. Another letter that the Sodders received that year in 1967 brought the Sodders what they believed was the most credible evidence that at least Louis was still alive. One day, Jenny found a letter that was addressed to her that had been postmarked in Central City, Kentucky, with no return address. Inside was a picture of a young man of around 30 with features strongly resembling Louis', who would have been 30 if he had survived the fire. On the back was written, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie." So I really don't know what the other information on the back of the picture is. It kind of looks like it could be some address maybe with a zip code. I'm not sure, but you can look at it and maybe you know what it means. George admitted to the Charleston Gazette-Mail later the next year, so about 1968, that the lack of information had been, quote, like hitting a rock wall. We can't go any further. He nevertheless vowed to continue. In another interview, he said, quote, time is running out for us, but we only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them. George Sodder died in 1969. Jenny and her surviving children, except John, who never talked about the night of the fire except to say that the family should accept it and get on with their lives, continued to seek answers to their questions about the missing children's fate. After George's death, Jenny stayed in the family home, putting up fencing around it and adding additional rooms. For the rest of her life, she wore black in mourning and tended the garden at the site of the former house. After her death in 1989, the family finally took the weathered, worn billboard down. The surviving Sodder children, joined by their own children, continued to publicize the case and investigate leads. They, along with older Fayetteville residents, have theorized that the Sicilian Mafia was trying to extort money from George and that the children may have been taken by someone who knew about the planned arson and said that they would be safe if they left the house. People theorize that the children were possibly taken back to Italy, and if the children had survived all those years and were aware that their parents and siblings had survived too, the family believes that they may have avoided contact in order to keep them from harm. Sylvia Sodder Paxton, the youngest in the family, died in 2021. She was in the house on the night of the fire, which she said was her earliest memory. Quote, I was the last one of the kids to leave home. She said that her and her father often stayed up late talking about what might have happened. Quote, I experienced their grief for a long time. She believed that her siblings survived that night and assisted with efforts to find them and publicize the case. Sylvia's daughter said in 2006, quote, she promised my grandparents she wouldn't let the story die, that she would do everything that she could. In the 21st century, these efforts have come to include online forums like websleuths.com, in addition to media coverage. The increase in the latter has led some who have examined the case to believe that the children did in fact die in 1945. George Bragg, who is a local author who wrote about the case in his 2012 book West Virginia's Unsolved Murders, believes that John was telling the truth in his original count when he said he tried to physically awaken his siblings before leaving the house. He allows, though, that conclusion may still not be correct. Quote, logic tells you they probably did burn up in the fire, but you can't always go by logic. Stacey Horn, who did a segment on the case for National Public Radio around its 60th anniversary in 2005, also believes that the children's death in the fire is the most plausible solution. In a post on her blog, she noted that the fire had continued to smolder all night after the house had collapsed and that the 2 hours was not enough time to search the ashes thoroughly. Even if it had been, the firefighters may have not known what to look for. However, she said, quote, there is enough genuine weirdness about this whole thing that if someday it is learned that the children did not die in the fire, I won't be shocked. I think I kind of second that, but what do you think happened to the Sodder children that fateful night? I'll quickly go over some of the main theories in the case. Obviously, the first theory is that the children did indeed perish in the fire, and because of a shoddy investigation and the fact that their father covered in the scene with dirt just a couple of days later before a more thorough investigation was done, their remains have just never been found. One of the more popular theories is that the Mussolini loyalists had lashed out at George Sodder to punish him for being so outspokenly anti-fascist. The theory goes that they snuck into the house, abducted the children, and then lit the house on fire to kill the rest. With this theory, though, why they wouldn't have just killed the entire family is unclear. Another theory that seems to prevail to today involves the Italian Mafia. Like I mentioned, locals thought that the local mafia had tried to recruit George and he had declined. They tried to extort money from him and he refused. And they believe that the children were kidnapped by someone they knew, someone who burst into the unlocked front door, told them about the fire, and offered to take them someplace safe. The children might not have survived the night, and if they had lived for decades, and if it really was Louis in that photograph, they had failed to contact their parents only because they wanted to protect them. Me? I am not sure what to believe because logically I feel like the children did die in the fire, but why no remains were found is weird. Anybody in the true crime community, like I said, knows how hard it is to burn a body. There's always something left behind, and this is often after the body has been burning for several days. But we are also talking about 1945, the fact that the search was reportedly only for 2 hours. Maybe searchers didn't know what they were looking for. And then add on to the fact that George covered the house within days with dirt. I mean, who knows if more could have actually been found. Or were no remains found in the ashes because they were not there? Because years later, a thorough search was done. You would think if there were remains, the bones would still have been there and they would have been found. A quote from Jenny years after the tragedy really sums up the whole mystery, I think. Quote, "You can't tell me 5 children could burn up in a little old house like that and something wouldn't be left. No, I'll never believe it. Somebody stole them, that's what." Hey everybody, I just wanted to pop on here to say thank you for all the support. I'm really trying to get a few things off the ground, so bear with me. I don't have the time that I would love to have to devote to this, so it's definitely for me a work in progress. So right now I have a very basic website set up. Just a free site with GoDaddy because I just wanted to kind of feel out the waters a little bit before I actually start paying for a website. Like I said, it's very basic, but I'm working on adding to it and would love and appreciate any tips that you may have. So if you would like to view the website, it is at www.unjustcrimes.godaddysite.com. Again, it's very basic, and I'm just kind of testing out the waters here. I'm thinking of adding some merchandise, maybe, I'm not really sure. Kind of going to see how it goes from here. I'm also working on getting the podcast uploaded onto other places like Spotify, for example. I originally started with YouTube because when I started a few years back, it really wasn't worth anybody in Canada's while to do a podcast with hosting in the States, unless you had some pretty good sponsors. And for me, with very limited time, I haven't been very lucky in that department. So YouTube felt like the right place to start. But I think I'm kind of ready now to start branching out a little bit, and I'll keep you posted on that. Like I've mentioned before, I do have a PayPal link on my YouTube page for anybody that would want to make a donation. Trust me, it's very much appreciated. It takes a lot of time to put these stories and videos together, and I really try very hard to put them together, always keeping the families of the victims and the victims in mind. I try to be as respectful as I can be because the last thing I want to do is to offend a family member who has already been through so much. You may now also follow Unjust Crimes on Facebook and Instagram, and I'll put those links in the comments to the video. With all of that business out of the way, happy holidays to you if you do celebrate the holidays, and I will be back in the new year with some more true crime stories. So that's the last one I'll be doing before the holiday season, and I know it's probably not the best audio that I have done, but I really didn't have time to re-record and edit before the holidays, but I do hope that you enjoyed it. Please do like this video and subscribe to my channel, and until next time, stay safe out there.